Thank you so much for your patience.
This meeting
Of
is
course,
being recorded.
it wouldn't be a virtual event if there was not some type of technical difficulty. This is actually only our second time having issues today, so I'd say we had a really, really good day. I'm going to be introducing you to our last speaker of today. We have with us Mrs. Megan Munoz, who's going to be speaking on remission versus reversal. That is the question. We're really excited for your session, and I know we're short on time, so I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you, Megan.
Okay, and it's not their fault, it's my fault for being late. So I will try to get the most important points across during this and leave some time for question and answer. But I'm really happy to be part of this presentation and part of this summit. So thank you guys so much. So my name is Megan Munoz. I am a certified diabetes care and education specialist. My background was starting out on the med floor, but majority of my career has been in diabetes, so inpatient, outpatient, online. And for a couple of years, I did a podcast called Type 2 and You with Meg. So I still have those episodes live, but just got to be really time consuming. And so I didn't continue that, but I really enjoyed it. And so I added some animations to this just to kind of make it interesting. So that's me in animation. I never dressed that nice, but I thought I'd dress up for this presentation. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have some animation with questions that people tend to ask me as a certified diabetes care and education specialist about diabetes reversal or remission. I think that's a really popular question. So whether you have diabetes or whether you're a healthcare professional, this is a common question that may come up. And so hopefully this will answer some of those burning questions you might have if you have type 2 diabetes, or help you answer those questions for people with type 2 diabetes if you're a healthcare professional.
I keep getting ads about diabetes reversal. Is it possible? What does it take to reverse my diabetes? To lose weight, right?
I saw an article about diabetes reversal called The Direct Study. The co-lead, Professor Roy Taylor, was quoted as saying this means we can now see type 2 diabetes as a simple condition where the individual has accumulated more fat than they can cope with. Through diet and persistence, patients are able to lose the fat and potentially reverse their diabetes. Is that true? My healthcare friend told me that diabetes remission studies are mentioned in the American Diabetes Association and World Health Organization guidelines. That's exciting. But I don't know what that means for me.
I wonder if there are any risks to trying to put my diabetes in remission. It sounds like there'd be some work to it, but not bad. And just think, I wouldn't have to worry about diabetes complications anymore, right?
So I think you can see that these are, could everybody hear that okay? Yes?
Yes, we can hear just fine.
Okay. I just want to make sure. So I think those are really common questions that come up, and those are the ones that I'm going to try to address today. So the first
ads about diabetes reversal. Is it possible?
So the first question is,
what does it take to reverse my
sorry, let me see if I can get,
I keep
so the first question we're going to tackle is this one.
I keep getting ads about curing or reversing my diabetes. Is it possible?
So curing or reversing diabetes, that's the big overlying question. Is it possible? And so I just want you to know that there's currently no cure for diabetes. There's no product, there's no program, there's no treatment that cures diabetes. And in fact, the FDA has quite a few warnings out about products or programs that claim to cure diabetes. So that piece of it is not accurate or not true. A lot of times if you see advertisements or things like that come across your emails or across your Facebook accounts, things like that, a lot of times people are trying to sell something. So just keep in mind, just be a little bit cautious about some of those things. And as far as reversing diabetes is not an accurate term, and we'll kind of talk about why. So if we think about reversal versus remission, reversal means a complete change of direction. So that means diabetes is completely gone. Remission means it's the lessening of the symptoms of diabetes. So when we look in the medical world, remission is more accurate as far as describing near normal blood sugars if somebody has diabetes and has been able to achieve near normal blood sugars. So remission is the term that we would use. Reversal isn't suggested simply because a lot of these underlying issues that happen and lead to type 2 diabetes are still going on. So sometimes there's still insulin resistance. Sometimes there's still what we call metabolic syndrome, where people struggle with weight in the middle part of their body, or they have higher blood sugars, blood pressure, and cholesterol levels. So those types of things can still be true even if somebody's blood sugars are in healthier ranges or near normal ranges. So I just want you to know that remission is more accurate as far as terms. And we'll kind of talk in more detail why that is, even just beyond these definitions. So I want you to know that even experts have trouble defining remission. There's two big expert consensus statements. So expert consensus statements are when a group of diabetes experts or medical experts come together and they look through the research and they try to decide what is the best information to provide people when we talk about remission. So this is what these groups came up with. The most recent one divided remission into two groups. They looked at remission based on surgical interventions like gastric bypass studies or pharmacological interventions like weight loss medications. And they defined diabetes remission as an A1C less than 6.5%. So I just want to remind people an A1C of less than 6.5% is technically still pre-diabetes. But an A1C of less than 6.5%, no diabetes medications. And if somebody is able to achieve that for 3 months or longer, they consider that diabetes remission. If we look at lifestyle, so if somebody does a certain type of program, so eating strategies, exercise strategies, they're able to do that for 6 months. Their A1C is less than 6.5%. After that 6 month time period, and they're off diabetes medications, after that 6 month time period, they would consider that diabetes remission. So that's the most recent expert consensus. An older expert consensus looked more at length of time and diabetes, and the A1C level. So you can see here, they looked at a longer period of time and they kind of defined remission as partial, complete, and prolonged. So a partial remission is still that A1C less than 6.5%, so pre-diabetes ranges for blood sugars, off diabetes medications. And if somebody did that for an entire year and was still able to maintain those blood sugar levels off diabetes medicines, they would call that partial remission. If someone was actually able to achieve normal blood sugars, so non-diabetes range blood sugars, that would be an A1C less than 5.7%, and do that without diabetes medications, that would be called complete remission if that lasted for a year. And then prolonged remission would be looking at that normal blood sugar range, so that lower A1C, off diabetes meds for a duration of 5 years. So you can see just how different these two groups looked at remission, even though they were experts. I tend to prefer this 2009 consensus statement because when we look at the lifespan of somebody with diabetes, it tends to be true that somebody, as they age with diabetes, is going to have a little bit more trouble achieving remission as their body changes over the years. So I think looking at these shorter time frames of 3 and 6 months is often not probably a great way of looking at remission versus when we're looking at longer periods of time, like a year to 5 years. But I just wanted to give you this baseline to give you an understanding of how to define remission. When they define remission, even when we look at different studies, so we have this expert consensus group, right? But every study also can be varied as well. So you could look at one study, for example, the direct study, and they defined remission anywhere from 2 months to a year. Another study, the Verta Health, they allowed people to continue metformin, and that's how they defined remission. In gastric bypass studies, they use different A1C cutoffs of 6% instead of 5.7% or 6.5%, which is similar to some of the remission expert guidelines. So I think it's also important when you see headlines and you see information about remission that not only can it vary among experts, but it also may vary along the lines of how the study was conducted. So it makes it really complicated for people when they're trying to understand what does remission look like, whether you're a healthcare professional or you are a person with diabetes. What does diabetes remission look like? And what does it take to get there? So I just want you to remember that remission is a more accurate term. And you really need to ask yourself, how do you define remission if you have type 2 diabetes? That's a really important question to ask yourself. As a healthcare professional, we really need to look at those expert guidelines, pick one of those, and use those as a way to define remission, simply because that will help our people with diabetes have a more concrete view of what remission looks like. I think the lack of uniformity in defining remission makes it really hard to nail down exactly what that looks like. So, and then of course, there's no cure for diabetes, and reversal is not an accurate term. Okay, so let's go on to our next question.
If I do want to try to achieve diabetes remission, where do I start?
So if somebody wants to achieve diabetes remission, where do they start? That's a great question. So diabetes remission studies are really broken down in a number of different ways. There's lifestyle interventions, which could look like calorie restrictions, so eating a really small amount of calories, being incredibly active. It could also look like a specific diet. So maybe they're not limiting the number of calories, but they're looking at a specific type of diet, like a Mediterranean diet or a keto diet. And then, so those are considered lifestyle interventions. But then there's also surgical interventions. So one of the studies I looked at with that was the Swedish outcome study. It's a pretty big study looking at all different types of gastric bypass surgeries and remission rates for that particular study. So these are the studies that I looked at, just so you have a reference. I think the slides are going to be added so you can reference those, but that's kind of where we start when we look at diabetes remission. It's important to know that in these studies, so think about where you are in your type 2 diabetes diagnosis, and for providers, think about where you are with the people that you work with. Many times in these studies, people have a near target A1C, often 7.5% is pretty typical. People are usually very early on into their diagnosis, 5 or 6 years into diagnosis in these studies. Many people use minimal medications. There's few insulin users in a lot of these studies. One of the big things is interventions to try to achieve remission are often repeated during these studies. So if someone starts edging out of that remission phase, their blood sugars start rising or their weight starts rising, then they might add a weight loss medicine or increase a weight loss medicine or increase activity or decrease food. So it wasn't like they just did one intervention and then you either have remission or you don't. This was a constant effort by the people in these studies to try to achieve this remission. So just keep that in mind. And then for some of those surgical studies, they were able to use a lower body mass index than what somebody might need to qualify for a gastric bypass surgery in the quote unquote real world. And there's really an overall fixation on weight loss to achieve remission. And I'm going to talk about in a little bit why that's so important, because that's going to be an important piece of this. So let's break it down a little further. Let's hear our next question.
What are my chances of success?
So what are your chances of success? What does it look like?
What are my
It really depends on the length of time you've had diabetes, the medications your body needs, your social and financial resources, your access to medical care and support, and really how you define remission or success. For some people, getting off of insulin and being on tablets for diabetes, to them, that's remission. For some people, it's completely off medication. So for you personally with having diabetes, how do you define it? That might be different than your medical provider. But as far as the medical team, we really need to define remission as those expert guidelines define. So here are kind of some of those statistics behind these studies that I've looked at. So the direct study that looked at diabetes remission, at year 1, 46% of people achieved remission. That's only based on 2 months worth of data. So in the black, with the little asterisks where it says actual, you'll see I compared the, I put actual in a few lines here. That means that I wasn't really able to gauge that against expert guidelines because they used a really small length of time of only 2 months to gauge how many people had remission a year into the study. So they did a lot of interventions and then only looked at 2 months worth of data to see remission rates. Year 2, that remission rate dropped to 36%. The look ahead study, year 1, 11% achieved remission. And the look ahead study was more based on heart health, but they did look at remission. So that's why I added this in here. About a third of people that had diabetes remission returned to diabetes status each year. In the Verta Health, they claimed the first year that about 60% of people achieved remission. Year 2, 54% achieved remission. But when we compare it to expert guidelines, remember this is the study, they allowed them to continue using metformin. Actually, only 25% achieved partial remission that first year, and it was less the next year. So you can see the Mediterranean diet, they had people that were newly diagnosed, and they looked at how long it would take for them to have to start medications for diabetes. So when we kind of look at remission rates that way, staying in that range of 6.5% or less, that pre-diabetes level, it took, the remission rate was 14% and then 5%. So I think it's really important when we look at this, that each year, as you'll notice, fewer and fewer people had remission. So if you're trying to achieve remission, just think about that piece of it, is that it's probably not going to be a long-lasting thing, and that's okay. But you just need to go in with that mindset that this is probably going to be a lot of work, and there's probably going to be some long-term work, and there may not be long-term results as far as remission. And we also have to understand kind of some of these pieces behind the study, like how they gauged remission, whether metformin was used or not. Or, for example, in the direct study, 75% of people that started this study were either using no meds or one med. So that's a very small number of medications. It's very different than somebody that might be using 3 or 4 different medications and trying to achieve remission. When we look just at the general population, there was a study that was done, and it looked at 122,000 people with type 2 diabetes. And if we use those 2009 expert guidelines, about 1.4% of those people achieved partial remission. So that was an A1C less than 6.5% for a year. Less than 0.5% achieved complete remission. And then a very small number of people were able to achieve remission over a 5-year period. So it's not as easily achievable as it might sound sometimes. The other thing I just want to point out really quickly, that this is true of gastric bypass studies as well. The remission trends change year to year, so fewer and fewer people actually achieve remission year to year. However, I think we also need to look at, and this is more gauged toward healthcare professionals, but we also have to look at and be very careful when somebody reports things as percentages. So for example, when they reported remission rates in year 2, they said they had 73% of people achieved remission. Year 15, they said 30% of people were still in remission after gastric bypass surgeries. But the number of people that they were looking at in those follow-ups was less and less each year. So you kind of have to look at the initial amount of people that had weight loss surgery. That's what WLS stands for, which is 2,000 people. And the follow-up by year 15, where we're looking for remission rates, they were looking at 115 people. So sometimes those percentages can skew information and not quite tell the whole story. So when we look at achieving is how possible is it to achieve remission, we have to kind of look below the surface, okay? So for example, in the direct study, half of the people needed to be on what they call a rescue plan at least one time. So a rescue plan was somebody's blood sugar started to rise or their weight started to rise, and they had to return to using supplements. Just ignore that. They had to return to using supplements or food supplements, which was part of the direct studies. It was using supplements as a treatment plan in place of food, so a meal replacement. So half of people needed that at least once, so they could have been on it multiple times. They might have added in more activity, they might have been added in weight medicine. So there was continued intervention, which is true of a lot of these studies. When we look at gastric bypass studies, it's very common for there to be a high dropout rate. And that's true of actually all these remission studies. There's a pretty high dropout rate, which can kind of skew data and information, because we don't know what happened to the other 25% of the people that might have dropped out. Did they drop out because they weren't having great luck with the remission? If that's the case, then if we add them into the total group that did the remission study, the remission rates might be quite lower than what was reported. And then the look ahead study, it's also important to note, how much intervention happened between a control group, so what a group that wasn't really touched and intervened with, and a group that had interventions to try to achieve remission. So sometimes studies, for those of you that have type 2 diabetes, sometimes studies are set up so you have a group that would get normal, quote unquote, normal healthcare, and then you have a group that gets this extra intervention or these extra treatments, and then they compare the two. Is the normal care better, worse, the same than this extra intervention that is going on in this intervention group? But sometimes that can be skewed as well. So in the look ahead study, the people that were in the intervention group that were getting this extra care, they had over 90 touch points with healthcare professionals compared to a control group that only had 15 touch points. And so this control group, if they had 90 touch points, would the intervention be pretty comparable? Would the outcomes be pretty comparable? I think that's a really good question to ask, because we know from research and we know from experience that when people have improved access to their healthcare providers, their healthcare also improves. Their health improves, they do well. So sometimes that can just really skew data. So there's a lot of layers to remission studies when we look at them kind of and break them down. This is also true of gastric bypass studies. Sorry. The remission rates vary really based on the type of bypass performed. We also have to consider when somebody has gastric bypass, they actually have an anatomical change, so a physical change to the way their body is shaped. And sometimes that impacts, just that alone impacts the blood sugars outside of weight. So for example, we have certain medications that work on the gut that help the gut respond better to food. We're starting to learn more about gut response to blood sugars. There's even studies where they cauterize the lining of the duodenum, which is part of the small intestine. And just by doing that and kind of cauterizing the lining, they can actually influence the blood sugars. And so they really started looking into this because of gastric bypass surgeries, because people often saw a big drop in their blood sugars even before the weight loss, so directly after surgery, if they had a surgery that impacted the duodenum. So there are anatomical differences that might influence the blood sugars regardless of weight. We also have to look at the amount of food or caloric intake that somebody has. Generally, people need 1,800 to 3,200 calories. That's a very broad guideline. But somebody that has gastric bypass surgery, it's pretty typical that they might need 900 to 1,000 calories. So that's, if we took somebody that didn't have this anatomical change to their body, didn't have this surgery, and we only had them eat 900 to 1,000 calories, they might have healthier blood sugars too. So there's there's some different things to just kind of think about and look at. It's not always just black and white when it comes to remission studies. And finally, lifestyle interventions can be very different in studies compared to the real world, right? So if we think about all these 90 appointments that one of the studies had and how much each of those appointments would have cost, that could easily add up to thousands of dollars, not counting lost work hours. If we do supplements, like some of the studies, like the direct study, an example of supplement, like a supplemental program, like a meal replacement program, is Ideal Protein. That can cost thousands of dollars sometimes over the months that you would take to do a program like that. Gym memberships and workouts. So there's a lot of cost that's covered in some of these studies that may not be accessible for people that have diabetes or people in general that are trying to lose weight. And then same with social resources. A lot of people don't have access to primary care providers. There's not enough certified diabetes care and education specialists and registered dietitians to go around. There's a relationship between poverty and diabetes. So people that have fewer resources have a higher risk of diabetes, which means that some of these interventions are not even within their reach. So there's just some other pieces to think about when you're thinking about remission. So the big takeaways are that remission rates decline year over year across all studies, regardless if it was a lifestyle or surgical. You really need to look beyond the headlines to see how studies were conducted to really understand what's kind of going on behind the scenes. There are a lot of biological reasons that remission can be hard. Remission is less likely if you've had diabetes a longer period of time or if your body needs insulin, and that's true across all studies. And remember, study participants, they had to repeat interventions, and they really had endless resources and personnel at their disposal, which may be a little bit harder for somebody trying to achieve remission outside of these studies. So let's look at another question.
Are there risks? I mean, isn't remission an altogether good thing?
So are there risks? Isn't it usually just an altogether good thing? And there are some risks just to think about. I think the big overarching thing that I want to touch on is that there's a lot of weight and disease stigma built into these studies. I'm hoping that someday they can create some studies that are maybe not based so much on someone's body size and looking at ways where people can try to achieve remission that's a little bit easier to obtain as far as cost or workload. But right now, a lot of it is really based on this really simple idea that diabetes and someone's body size is based on personal health choices. That's simply a really too black and white way of looking at diabetes remission and diabetes and body size in general. We know, and for those of you that have diabetes, I apologize because this picture on here probably looks super intimidating, but we know thus far in science that there are 11 different body parts or pathways that are malfunctioning in the body and causing the blood sugars to rise. So this is just an image of that. For those of you that have type 2 diabetes, that's what this image represents. There are all these different pathways, they're malfunctioning, and they lead to higher blood sugars. So type 2 diabetes is a very complex health condition underneath the surface. Not a very simple black and white thing. We also know that lifestyle and behavior interventions like increased physical activity and how much you eat, it rarely results in long-lasting changes to body weight. There are so many other influences on body weight. And if you look at the statistics, a lot of people might see their weight dip the first year or two doing some of these interventions, but then they often regain by year 5. So there's been a consensus statement, and it included people from the American Diabetes Association looking at and calling for an end to weight bias and stigma around body size, and particularly around type 2 diabetes, because it is very limiting on what people can get for healthcare if they have a lot of stigma attached to their body size and to diabetes itself. We also know that our health habits are important, and our genes also influence our health, but access to healthcare and our social and environmental pieces are huge when it comes to our risk for diseases and body size as well. So health habits are a piece of the puzzle, but they're not quite as big of a piece as many people lead it to be. It's one piece of the picture, but it's not all the picture. We also know that weight stigma contributes to weight gain, chronic stress, higher nutrition intake, lower physical activity, and higher mortality. We also know as well that when people experience stigmas, which is very widely documented in healthcare settings, it's a barrier for seeking out medical care, for getting disease prevention, treating diseases like diabetes, and supporting a healthy quality of life. So I think it's just really concerning that there is so much weight and disease stigma in these studies, because we really want to try to get away from that when we're studying care for people with diabetes. There are nutritional risks to consider. So there's severe calorie restrictions in a lot of these groups. And sometimes that means that there are nutritional deficiencies. So people are short certain nutrients that their body is really depending on to function well. So they have to use supplements. And so a lot of these studies did monitor people closely and replace certain vitamins and minerals that they needed that they were no longer getting from food because of these extreme dietary patterns. The concern is that the majority of people with type 2 diabetes have not seen a registered dietitian nutritionist. And that was, so that's really concerning. If we have somebody that's doing pretty extreme eating patterns, they really need to be connected with somebody in healthcare, especially someone with the skill set of a registered dietitian to help support whatever their goals. It's also important that despite efforts, just like Remission, the vast majority of people regained weight in the study. So we saw that year over year remission rates declined. Less and less people were achieving remission year to year in these studies. That's also true of weight. So less and less people maintained that weight loss as the years went on in these studies. And these were not long studies. So a lot of these studies we're not looking at 10 years or 5 years. The Swedish outcome study was, but the lifestyle intervention not necessarily. And there are some connections between type 2 diabetes and disordered eating. And so just with this last 10 minutes, I want to touch on looking at risks and kind of giving you a comparison. So for those of you that don't know what the Minnesota Starvation Study is, the Minnesota Starvation Study is a group of men that were asked to go up to Minnesota, to the university up there, and they were studied. They were actually starved, and they studied these men as they reduced their calories and had them be active, and looked at the impacts of the starvation. This was during World War II, and this was an effort to understand how does the body respond to starvation, and how do we refeed someone's body after they've been in starvation, and so that they could understand what they needed to do for people that were starving around the world. I want to use that study as a comparison to some of the diabetes remission studies. And the reason I want to do that is because by today's standards, the Minnesota Starvation Study would be considered unethical. It would be something we wouldn't do to intentionally starve someone and then see what the effects would be. Yet, when we look at the Minnesota Starvation Study, which is at the bottom of your screen, they were asked to eat about 1,600 calories a day during the starvation phase, and they were walking about 22 miles a week, okay? The Look Ahead study, people ate anywhere from 1,200 to 1,800 calories a day, and they walked about 35 miles a week. And then when we look at the direct study, that first 6 months of the direct study, people were given 800 calories a day, so half of what the Minnesota Starvation Study looked at. And then they were asked to walk 56 miles a week or 8 miles a day. So it's a little concerning that the Minnesota Starvation Study wouldn't be revisited. Yet we're kind of doing it in the name of diabetes. So it's just a little concerning that it's so restrictive. And sometimes we talk about diets and calories so much that you can get skewed on how much is too little. So I think this helps really put it into perspective. There's also short-term effects, and I really do appreciate the direct study looking at the short-term effects of this starvation phase, that first 6 months that they had people use 800 calories. So what I did is I actually wrote those down, the side effects that they looked at that first 6 months, and compared them to the side effects that they saw or noted in the Minnesota starvation experiment or Minnesota starvation study. See, I spelled experiment wrong. It looks wrong right now. Maybe I didn't. So a lot of these were very similar. So if you ever had a chance to read about the Minnesota starvation study, it's kind of an interesting study to read on, but it's a little concerning that there was very much some similarities between both the direct study and the Minnesota starvation experiment. Also concerning is that that some studies resulted obviously in like a fast short-term weight loss with fast weight regain. When that happens, that's called weight cycling, and that can actually cause changes in your muscle mass, your insulin resistance, the insulin levels in your body, glucose levels, hypertension, lipids, and sometimes that can actually lead to higher risks for cardiovascular disease. So that's a really concerning piece as well. The more your body yo-yos up and down in weight, there's some studies that show it can increase the risk of heart-related problems. There's also a concern that some of these diets are, when we start reducing the amount of carbohydrate pretty significantly, we have to obviously replace it with something. And one of those things often is protein. And so with the Vertra or diet, which is pretty similar to the keto diet, with that study, they were eating nearly double the recommended amount of protein. And it did impact people's kidney function. So GFR is a sign of kidney function. And I think it's also important to note that everybody I've met seems to have a different interpretation of what a keto diet is. So, so just kind of have to ask yourself, what does that look like to you? Because I think people interpret it all different kinds of ways. But in this particular program, they did eat double the amount of protein. It did affect their kidney function, which is something we wouldn't want with diabetes. And then obviously, if somebody was trying to do this without the guidance of skilled medical care watching these kind of impacts, then it would be concerning that it would get missed. And then the gastric bypass studies, one of the risks that would be worrisome is the risk for mental illness afterwards. So the rates of suicide and mental illness are higher, even when looking at long-term studies. So a number of people, 25,000 people over 15 years after gastric bypass surgery, the rates of suicide are higher and the rates of mental illness are higher after those surgeries. So those are my big takeaways, is weight disease and stigma are really woven into these studies and they have consequences of their own. So it's something to think about. Ongoing medical care is likely needed if you're going to achieve remission. Achieving remission doesn't necessarily eliminate underlying body malfunctions like insulin resistance. So you really do still need to have screenings for complications of diabetes. And that was recommended by that 2021 consensus group. That's one thing I was really happy they put in there that wasn't in the older consensus group, that if you do achieve diabetes remission, you still need to be screened for diabetes complications on a regular basis. It's important to note that remission might take some extreme eating patterns and physical activity patterns, and sometimes that can lead to health and social consequences. So just think about that piece of it if you're going to try to work towards diabetes remission. And then a rising A1C or body weight after achieving remissions, not really a sign of personal failure. I know a lot of people get really down on themselves if they see their body weight rise or their A1C rise after working really hard to get healthier blood sugars or achieve remission. That is not a sign of failure. Often there's biological underlying reasons that you don't have as much control over that can lead to that. So I just don't want you to get discouraged if you see that happen. That seemed to happen across all studies. So it tells us that that's a biological or a body function that's happening because everybody in these studies was really highly motivated to achieve remission, right? So let's listen to the last question.
Anything else I should think about? What haven't I asked?
Anything else?
Anything
So just some final questions to ask yourself, and I'll leave you guys to review these because I think these are just some things to think about after we've gone over things. So this is for people with type 2 diabetes. Why are you interested in exploring remission? What does remission look like to you? And what are you willing and able to do? So there's some underlying questions under those. And since the slides are attached, I'll let you guys look at those. Some things to think about that if you're thinking about decreasing your burden of diabetes self-care, what does that look like? Because often remission is pretty, or trying to achieve remission is pretty burdensome in itself. So really ask yourself, what are you trying to achieve with remission? Achieving remission and weight loss, the overwhelming evidence shows that weight loss and remission trends decline annually in these in these studies. I also want you to know it's okay to stop. If you decide you want to do this, by all means, go for it. If you decide partway through it's too much, you don't want to do it, that's okay. It doesn't mean you're a failure. It's okay to stop. And I want you to know it's not all or nothing. So eating well, being active, regardless of your body size, regardless of your ability to achieve remission, is a great goal to have and a great thing to do. So don't throw everything in the bucket and say, okay, if I don't achieve remission, screw everything and I'm not going to do anything else. There's a lot of gain you can have just by changing some health habits, even if you don't achieve remission. And here are some things to think about if you're a healthcare professional. So using the consensus group guidelines to define remission, looking at, are these studies ethical? It's a really important question. To remember that every time and everything, there is a season. So normalize that for your person with diabetes that you're working with, that it's okay to go towards achieving remission, and it's okay to stop. And that healthcare routines can make a great impact on health regardless of status. And that really studies are built on a very simple view of diabetes and weight. And those are very complex factors. So those are things you can kind of review a little bit more yourself. But it's just real important to remember for those of you with type 2 diabetes, this is your body and your journey. So taking an active role in your health, regardless of your diabetes status, is a win. So I just want you to know that. And I'll take any questions that you guys have now that we've got about 5 to 8 minutes.
Thank you so much for that, Megan. This was really great. It was awesome listening to this really spicy topic, right? This remission versus reversal. It is a hot topic. So appreciate you and all of your content. I have a question. So, in the last slide you have there, it really does talk about the individual and making this personalized, right? We have to make it realistic. We have to make it so that we're taking different cultures, ethnicities into consideration. What would you say is one of the things that educators should really point out, right? They're not always going to talk to them about a study, but what should they really kind of focus on when they are talking about remission versus reversal with their patients?
That's a great question. So I think this question I think the first part is to ask, tell me why you're interested in remission right now. What is your goal? Because sometimes people are thinking, I just don't want to have to take insulin anymore. Sometimes people are thinking, I'm just burnt out and I'm so tired of managing diabetes. And is there a way that we can help them achieve, whether they achieve remission or not, is there a way we can help decrease their burden? So I think that's the best place to start, is just asking, tell me more about your interest in achieving remission and what does that look like to you?
Yeah, I think that's really important to meet them where they are, where they're ready, and have that conversation together.
Yeah. And I will say this is a hard conversation because I don't want to discourage people. Like, I don't want to be a Debbie Downer and say, well, you're on insulin and you've had diabetes 25 years. It's probably a lower chance because somebody might be really interested in taking an active role in their health where they hadn't been before. So it is a hard conversation to have, and you want to encourage people, regardless where they're at, to be an active partner in their health. So,
yeah. One question I see in the chat was, how does one get involved in these studies? I don't know if you can answer that question or not, Megan, but that was just one of the questions that I see in the chat.
Oh gosh, I don't know. I think the direct study is still going on, but I think they're just looking at the group that they already started with. I don't know. I know that they have some studies on, what's the website, diabetes. It's like clinicaltrials.gov, I think. You can look up different trials. And so you could type in a search for diabetes remission trials. I know Verta Health, they have their own platform. So you can actually go and Google them. And then that's a program that you can get involved, I think, at any point. And they just do research reports based on the people that are in their studies. So
Very good. Thank you.
yeah.
Well, I don't see any other questions coming in the chat, but again, want to thank you, Megan, for your time and this conversation. Everyone who has joined us, really appreciate it. This is the end of the first day of the summit and really appreciate your participation. And please come check us out tomorrow.
Sounds good.
Awesome. Thank y'all so much. See y'all tomorrow.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye.
I'm so sorry for being late. I'm so sorry. Thank you for being patient. Bye, guys.
Bye, Megan.
Take care. Thank you. Let's stop record, Casey. Awesome.